Jim Jordan arrived in the House of Representatives in January of 2007. Before he got to Washington, he was a decorated collegiate wrestler at the University of Wisconsin, a two-time NCAA Division I champion. The kind of athlete who does not just compete, but studies competition the way an engineer studies a system, looking for the precise points of leverage that determine outcomes before the match even begins. That instinct, the instinct to find the pressure point and apply force to it early and continuously, never left him. It simply migrated from the wrestling mat to the hearing room. Over nearly 2 decades in Congress, Jordan developed a style of political combat that is as recognizable as a fingerprint. He talks fast. He moves through arguments the way a running back moves through a defensive line, not looking for an open lane, but creating one through momentum, and the refusal to slow down. He does not ask questions in committee hearings the way most members do, waiting for an answer, evaluating it, following the logic wherever it leads. He asks questions as a form of pressure. He uses them to establish a narrative, to create a specific impression in the mind of the viewer at home, and the answers are almost secondary to the psychological effect of the delivery. But the centerpiece, the true signature of the Jordan method, is the interruption. Not just any interruption. A specific kind. Surgically timed, consistently deployed, and targeted at the exact moment in an opponent's argument when disrupting it causes the most structural damage. Not at the start, when the person is still warming up and can easily pick the thread back up. Not at the end, when the point has already been made and the interruption is just noise. In the middle, in the building phase, when the logical architecture is still going up, when cutting the beam at that specific moment causes the whole thing to collapse before anyone in the room can see what it was becoming. This technique works because it exploits something fundamentally human. When we are building a complex thought, we need continuity. We need the thread to stay intact from premise through reasoning to conclusion. When that thread gets cut aggressively and publicly and repeatedly, most people do one of two things. They scramble, which means they lose the logical structure and end up in a weakened position. Or they abandon the line entirely and pivot to safer, more general territory. Either outcome is a win for Jordan. Either outcome confirms the fundamental assumption behind the entire approach, that disruption is a form of dominance, and that most people, when disrupted aggressively enough, will yield. The chairmanship of the House Judiciary Committee handed Jordan the most powerful version of this weapon he had ever held. Now he was not just a committee member deploying a tactic. He was the chair, with structural authority over time, over recognition, over the tempo of proceedings. He could slow things down when he needed to. He could speed things up when that served him better. He could use the formal power of the gavel to reinforce the informal power of his personality. The hearing room, in a very real sense, became an extension of his strategic toolbox, and he used it with the comfort of someone who has been practicing in the same gymnasium for 2 decades. That was the version of Jim Jordan who walked into the hearing room on the day in question. Confident, prepared, backed by years of institutional experience, and a method that had been tested against some of the most sophisticated political operators in Washington. That was the version who reached across the table and interrupted Jasmine Crockett. Now let us talk about who Jasmine Crockett actually is, not the biographical summary version, but the real version, the version that explains what happened next. Crockett came to the Texas 30th Congressional District in 2023, but her training did not begin in Washington. It began in courtrooms. Specifically, civil rights courtrooms, which are among the most adversarially demanding legal environments that exist. Civil rights litigation is not a practice area for people who need favorable conditions to perform well. The opposing counsel is frequently better funded. The institutional pressures often favor the other side. The facts are almost always contested vigorously. And the human stakes for the clients are almost always significant, which means the attorney carries not just the intellectual weight of building a legal argument, but the emotional weight of knowing what it costs if that argument falls apart. Years in that environment build something that is extraordinarily difficult to build any other way. It is not confidence in the shallow sense of believing in yourself. It is something closer to structural stability under pressure. The knowledge, earned through repeated experience rather than simply believed in, that you can think clearly when the room is hostile. that you can hold the architecture of a complex argument intact when someone is doing everything in their power to knock it down. That disruption is not the same as defeat, and that absorbing disruption without losing your footing is itself a form of competitive advantage in a room full of people who believe disruption is an unstoppable force. When Crockett started appearing in committee hearings, people who pay close professional attention to congressional proceedings noticed something. She was not doing what most freshman members do in those settings, which is use their time to signal alignment with their base, deliver statements designed for clips, and generally perform the role of a politician at a congressional hearing. She was doing something older and, in many ways, more effective. She was litigating. She came in with specific documents, specific facts, specific questions designed to establish specific things on the record, and she connected those pieces the way an attorney connects exhibits in front of a jury. Not for show, for the actual purpose of building a case. That discipline made her genuinely dangerous to the kind of strategy Jordan deploys, because his strategy depends on dealing with people who are either building arguments through momentum or building arguments through performance. Both types are vulnerable to aggressive interruption, because both lose something essential when the flow is broken. A momentum-based argument needs continuity. A performance-based argument needs an audience that is following the script. Cut either one in the middle, and you change the outcome. An attorney building a case on documented evidence is a different animal entirely. The facts do not change when the delivery gets interrupted. The document says what it says whether you let her finish the sentence or not. And someone trained to present those facts to a skeptical jury in a hostile courtroom does not need favorable atmospheric conditions to stay on point. She can pick the argument up from exactly the syllable where it was cut off, because the argument is not dependent on momentum or performance. It is dependent on the record, and the record is right there in front of her. The hearing started with the energy Jordan always generates in these settings. His side moved fast, set the frame aggressively, established the terrain before the other side had fully oriented themselves to where the battle lines were. Several early exchanges went the way Jordan had clearly mapped them out. Members pushed back, he talked over them. Arguments that might have complicated his narrative got buried under the speed and volume of what came next. The room ran at his preferred pace, and it felt like it was going to stay there. Crockett watched all of it. Not passively, not waiting for her turn with her notes in front of her. Watching the way a litigator watches opposing counsel in a deposition, identifying patterns, cataloging tendencies, noting the specific triggers that seemed to accelerate Jordan's aggression, and the moments where he pulled back even slightly. By the time her questioning block arrived, she had a functional map of how he was operating that day. She knew when the interruption was coming. She just did not yet know what she was going to do with it. She opened with a question so specific it was almost architectural. A very particular fact, documented, verifiable, narrow enough that the only real options were to address it directly or make the avoidance unmistakably visible. This was not accidental. Specific questions are harder to interrupt effectively than broad ones, because a specific question about a specific documented fact does not disappear when you cut off the person asking it. The fact is still sitting there on the table. The evasion becomes part of the record just as surely as the question does. Jordan recognized the direction she was heading the way experienced committee members recognize when a line of questioning is building toward somewhere they do not want to go. And he did what he always does in that situation. He deployed the interruption, loud, dismissive, coming at precisely the moment when her argument was building toward its most consequential point, designed to scatter the logical architecture before the committee could see where it was going. The room sharpened. This was the moment the hearing had been building toward without anyone quite articulating it. Crockett stopped. But here is the thing about how she stopped. She did not stop the way people stop when they have been genuinely derailed. There was no momentary blankness, no visible scramble to find the lost thread, no shift into the defensive posture of someone trying to reclaim footing. She stopped the way a surgeon puts down one instrument and picks up another. Completely deliberate, completely controlled, and in the stillness she created by stopping, before she said a single word, something had already changed in the room. She looked at Jordan, not with visible anger, not with the performed outrage that plays well in clips but reads as theater to anyone watching closely. Just looked at him with the focused, almost clinical attention of someone who is about to explain something important and wants to make sure everyone is paying attention before she begins. And then, she did something that may be the single most tactically sophisticated thing I have seen happen in a congressional hearing in years. She did not defend her right to finish her sentence. She did not appeal to the chair. She did not express frustration or lodge a procedural complaint. She turned the interruption into a lesson. She explained it out loud, in real time, to the entire committee. She walked them through what the interruption was designed to accomplish, why it had come at that specific moment in the argument rather than earlier or later, and what the choice to use it at precisely that juncture revealed about the vulnerability it was meant to conceal. She narrated the technique back to the room while it was still in the process of being deployed against her. Like a magician who stops mid-trick, shows the audience exactly where the card is hidden and why the misdirection was supposed to work, and then calmly continues with the trick anyway, because the reveal does not change the outcome, it just makes the audience understand what they are watching with a completely different level of clarity. Jordan, who had been leaning forward in the aggressive posture he uses when he is pressing an attack, absorbed this in real time, and the expression that landed on his face, described by multiple people in the room afterward in strikingly consistent language, was not anger. It was the expression of someone whose primary strategy has not just failed, but has been picked up, examined, explained to the audience, and set back down again with a label on it. There is a specific quality to that moment. It is different from being argued out of a position or losing a debate on the merits. It is the experience of having your method made visible by someone who understands it better in that moment than you expected anyone to. He tried again. A second interruption, harder and louder than the first, carrying the extra force that comes from the realization on some level that the first one had not landed the way it was supposed to, and that the solution is more pressure, not less. This is the internal logic of the approach. It only functions if the other person eventually yields. So when they do not yield the first time, the correct move within the framework of the strategy is to escalate. More volume, more aggression, more disruption until the disruption succeeds. Crockett absorbed it the same way she had absorbed the first one. Not unaffected, not pretending it was not happening, but refusing to let the disruption determine her response. And then she delivered the line. I am not going to try to manufacture suspense about the specific words, because the power was not in the specific words the way a quotable zinger's power lives in its specific words. The power was in everything the words completed. They were the final piece of an argument that had been building since the moment Jordan first cut across her. They took everything she had established, everything she had named and explained and demonstrated, and compressed it into a single observation about what was actually happening in that room and what it said about why the hearing was being run the way it was being run. The committee went still, not the performed stillness of decorum, the actual stillness of people who have just processed something and need a moment before they can continue. Jordan sat back, the lean, the physical signature of his aggressive forward energy, reversed. His body language shifted in the way that body language shifts when someone encounters something they did not have a prepared answer for and are trying to construct one in real time without letting the construction process become visible. He found words. Of course he did. 18 years of doing this means you can always find words. But the words he found were not his words from before the exchange. They were improvised words, reactive words, the words of someone who came in with a plan and is now operating without one. And then, Crockett did the most devastating thing of all. She returned to her original question, picked it up from the exact point where the first interruption had cut it off, continued the argument as if the interruptions, the comeback, the silence, the entire intervening drama had been a minor detour from which she had now simply returned. The message embedded in that return was impossible to miss. None of it had touched the argument. None of it had moved her off her footing. The technique that had defined Jordan's congressional presence for 18 years had been deployed twice, explained once, and then essentially walked through as if it were not there. The clip traveled immediately and organically, the way things travel when they capture something genuinely unexpected. People sent it to people who do not normally follow congressional hearings. Political observers who have seen thousands of these exchanges described it in terms they do not usually apply to committee proceedings. Legal professionals who understand what Crockett was doing at the technical level wrote about the specific quality of what they were watching, the decades of skill compression that made the response look almost effortless, and the significance of that apparent effortlessness as a demonstration. The responses from Jordan's side were telling in their shape. When supporters of a combatant in an exchange spend their energy defending the political positions underlying the exchange rather than the exchange itself, they are conceding the exchange. That was the pattern here. The substance of Jordan's policy positions was defended vigorously. The specific sequence of events in that hearing room, less so. What this moment reveals about both people is true in a way that is difficult to manage after the fact. About Crockett, this was not a lucky day. This was not an opponent who walked into an ambush he could not have seen coming. This was the product of a specific kind of preparation, meeting a specific kind of experience under the specific conditions that allow both to operate at full capacity. The composure was real. The analytical clarity in the middle of the exchange was real. The ability to turn the attack into the material of the response without losing the original argument was real, and it is the product of years of standing in rooms that were designed to make you fail. About Jordan, the vulnerability this exposed is genuine and it matters beyond this specific exchange. The interruption strategy has always been most effective against people who need unbroken flow to think clearly in adversarial settings. It was designed for, and refined against, a certain kind of opponent. The increasing presence in congressional committees of members with professional backgrounds built specifically for adversarial clarity under pressure represents a real strategic problem for an approach that depends on disruption as its primary mechanism. When you face someone who has spent years building arguments in conditions far more hostile than a committee room, the disruption does not just fail. It becomes a resource for the person you were trying to disrupt. It becomes the demonstration of exactly what they were arguing. It becomes material. That is the lesson this moment carries, and it is larger than either of the people involved in it. Washington is full of tools for avoiding accountability. Controlling the pace, deploying institutional authority, using volume and confidence to create the appearance of strength regardless of the underlying substance. These tools are real, and they are effective, and they have been effective for a very long time. What happens when they meet someone who cannot be rattled by pace, who is not impressed by institutional authority, who understands that volume is not evidence and confidence is not argument? And who has the specific training to say all of that out loud in the middle of the exchange in a way that the entire room immediately understands? The tool breaks. Not dramatically, not with a sound, just stops working. Jasmine Crockett was that person in that room. The interruption that was supposed to erase her became the moment that illustrated her. And Jim Jordan, who has spent the better part of 2 decades making the hearing room his arena, found himself for the first time in a long time being studied rather than studying, being explained rather than explaining, sitting back rather than leaning in. Washington remembers moments like this, not for the drama, but for what they reveal about the gap between the appearance of power and its actual limits. The committee went silent, and in that silence, everything that needed to be said had already been said. If this breakdown gave you something real, hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are not done bringing you the moments that actually matter. We will see you in the next one.